Well, I think we might as well begin because we have an hour. We could stretch it a little more, an hour and a half if everyone's willing, but see how far we go. This is a subject that would take a few years, and certainly when you look at the biographies of Shadi Hamid and Amira Maaty, you can see how much experience counts. Put together, I don't want to age them, but putting it together, you've got close to 50 years worth of experience there, and it shows in the creativity and the work they've been doing and their leadership in their respective organizations. So welcome everyone. We're going to be talking about the challenges and the prospects for democracy, democratic governance, civil society in the Middle East. A subject that has been oft debated, a lot of doubts and unhappiness in the last couple of decades, but always we have to have hope for a future. Shadi Hamid is a senior fellow in the project on U.S. relations with the Islamic world in the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. The author of a wonderful book, I've just been reading it over the weekend, Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World. And that's true because it's not just the Middle East phenomenon, by the way. It goes all the way to Malaysia and Indonesia. When you're looking at examples, varied examples of how Islam interacts with other elements of society and of governance. He has been the co-author of Rethinking Political Islam with Will McCants, co-author of Militants, Criminals, and Warlords, The Challenge of Local Governance in an Age of Disorder, also from Brookings. And his first book was Temptations of Power, Islamists and Illiberal Democracy in the New Middle East. Shadi served as a director of research at the Brookings Doha Center until January 2014, is a contributing writer at the Atlantic magazine and on the board of POMED, the Project on Middle East Democracy. And I also like to welcome and thank very much for joining us, Amira Maaty, who is the Senior Director for Middle East, North Africa programs at the National Endowment for Democracy. I was previously a Senior Program Officer overseeing Egypt and cross-regional programs at NED. Formerly the director of Intercultural Management Institute at American University School of International Service, looking at cross-cultural communication, dialogue, and negotiation, something that's quite close to my heart coming out of public diplomacy and academia. Amira has 17 years of experience in democratization, civil society development, and international training and education, obviously focused on the Middle East and North Africa. Has worked with IREX, with Internews. These are wonderful organizations in the exchange and development, democratic development field, and with the SICE program. Did her bachelor's degree at GW and her master's degree in international peace and conflict resolution from American University. So just to start the ball rolling, I wanted to ask Shadi and Amira to give us your overview, make a couple of points that you would like to make around the question of how do civil society and democratic governance stand in the Middle East. Any cases you want to refer to? I know you spent a lot of time on Egypt and Tunisia, Shadi, but other cases that you have in mind and the broader regional implications of the cases that you mentioned. And then we'll go on from there. There's so much to talk about. So Shadi, why don't you start and Amira follow?
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. Look forward to the conversation. So just to start with some overall thoughts on the topic, I was in Tahrir Square the day that Mubarak fell on February 11th, 2011. And it was one of those unusual and really great beautiful moments, like when I think about my own work and my own life, because, you don't always get a chance to see a revolution in the making. You don't always get a chance. Most people don't ever see that in real life, in the flesh. And so that was sort of the high point. And when I think back to that moment, first of all, it seems quite blurry in retrospect. So much has transpired from that point on that it becomes hard to recall the sense of optimism that people had at that particular moment. And I remember that no one knew that exactly when or even if Mubarak would resign. And, being in that space at that moment, when people heard the announcement, I still remember the joy and surprise and excitement that you saw in people. The crowd of hundreds of thousands of people, if not more, just erupted when the news sort of descended. But then we have a tragic history after that, and it happened all rather quickly. We had the military coup in Egypt in July 2013. In August 2013, we had the worst mass killing in modern Egyptian history, known as the Rabaa massacre, where about 1,000 people were killed in broad daylight. And then since then, there has been an increasingly repressive dictatorship in power in Egypt, as many of you will know. So, we're about 9 years after, more than 9 years after the Arab Spring started. And there's a lot to process and a lot to sort of, in retrospect, try to analyze and assess. One major question for me increasingly has been, what is the role of Islam in public life, and how do we find a way to accommodate that? Because when I look at why the Arab Spring failed, obviously there's a lot of factors, and I wouldn't want to oversimplify it, but one important factor is the role of religion in public life, the relationship between Islam and the state, and also the state and Islam. And the fact that Egyptians couldn't agree on what that role should be. And what you ultimately had was irreconcilable differences over very foundational questions around the meaning and purpose of the nation state, foundational questions around what it meant to be Egyptian, but you could also extend that to other countries, what it means to be Tunisian, what it means to be Jordanian. And questions of religion are inextricably intertwined with that self-identification. And so part of the story of the past 10 years, but also more broadly, I would actually if we want to go back, we can say that, for me also the year of 1924, not to go into too much detail about this, but, really ever since the fall of the last caliphate, so 1924 marked the formal abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate. And then after that, you have these fledgling nation states that gained independence later in the subsequent decades, but they were never really able to resolve these foundational questions about what it meant to be a citizen, what the role of religion was going to be. And the Arab Spring actually, it offered the promise and the possibility of at least coming to some understanding that even if Arabs disagree on foundational questions, that they would at least agree that the democratic process was the right means, the right set of mechanisms to address those foundational differences, not through violence and not through conflict, but ultimately through a peaceful participatory process. That to me was, and also to some extent still is, the promise of the Arab Spring and what it stood for, because I'm not someone who believes that there can ever be a real resolution to foundational questions. That's precisely what makes them foundational, that they deal with questions around the human condition, human behavior, first principles. And I think as we found out as Americans, and this is where I think a lot of the debates we had in the Middle East in the 9 or 10 years ago during the Arab Spring are being replicated in interesting ways in a number of other contexts, where we're realizing, even say in the case of the US, which is a consolidated democracy, and we didn't think necessarily that the foundational questions were as vital, but what we are finding out is that Americans do not agree on what it means to be American, on the founding, and we're having, I think, a profound and charged debate over the very meaning of the founding and when to even date our founding. And what that means is that politics takes on an existential tenor, which raises the question of, to what extent do we still as Americans have faith that democratic procedures can actually channel and absorb these divides and conflicts peacefully at home, but it also has implications for how we see our role abroad in terms of supporting and promoting the values that we claim to hold, whether that's small d democracy, small l liberalism, whether or not even the US has the confidence to promote its values abroad, considering that they seem to be under assault at home. So those are maybe just some thoughts to that we can return to in the conversation.
Amira, go for it, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you for the invitation. First I want to say, Shadi, I'm a little bit envious of you. I actually arrived in Egypt on January 25th, 2011, but I left 2 days before the Mubarak resignation, so I didn't get to see, that part of it. But I will say that, before traveling at that time, I had heard that there were protests planned for January 25th. This was, in response to an accumulation of events. And I remember getting off the plane and asking, a friend who picked me up, like how many people are actually out there. At that point, the largest demonstration or protest in Egypt was maybe 200 people, and that was the evening that we started seeing the images from Tahrir Square with the hundreds of thousands of people out on the street, basically calling for justice, freedom, bread, and really kind of tying economic grievances with their political situation. So I think that moment was kind of an interesting, but it's a moment, but we shouldn't see it as detached from a larger history and a series of events that preceded it and continue to happen after it. Mike, you asked me to talk about prospects for democratization in the region, and in short, it's an uphill battle, but it's one that's worth pursuing because, let's face it, what are the alternatives? And I think if there's anything to learn, and I think something that we're seeing now, as Shadi described, even in consolidated democracies, is that democratic struggles are generally not easy. And they're not linear, and they're sometimes 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, and they're often messy. So I think that's something to kind of remember and to keep in mind, and to keep in mind for perspective in terms of where things are in the region. On trends and developments to watch, I want to say a word about kind of this, the Arab Spring, and I know that the common narrative now is that the failed Arab Spring, and kind of the Arab Spring being written off as a one-off moment. That came and went, and actually in some countries left a much more difficult context and set of circumstances than there were before. I think it's important to remind, to remember that the Arab Spring, first of all, the first time that term was used was actually in 2005. So in 2005, we started seeing certain openings, often actually pushed by the international community to open up. That in 2005, we saw parliamentary elections in Egypt that actually saw the emergence of the Muslim Brotherhood as a political party represented in parliament. And at that point, actually, that contributed to the international community stepping back a little bit and saying, "Oh, wait, if we push too hard for democracy here, we're gonna deal with actors that we don't necessarily want." And I think, there's also been there were a series of events before 2011, and there continues to be a series of activities after. In 2019, we saw a whole new range of mass mobilizations in different countries in the region. I think we need to remember that there were a number of different factors that contributed to that. So you had developments in the information space. Before, in the early part of the 2000s, there was very limited access to information outside of the information that was purely under state control in these regions. With the emergence of satellite television, with the emergence of social media, the information space was transforming. At the same time, with the information space transforming, you saw changes in the political narrative and changes in political awareness. So the idea that people's economic and social development and well-being was detached from politics and their leadership, that started evolving. People started tying their economic well-being with, the political structures and systems and institutions that they had in place. We also started seeing evolutions in how people organize. Like, in the past, these are tightly controlled spaces. So the only real area that you can organize or mobilize had been, within kind of the religious establishment. So that's where you saw kind of the Islamist groups playing that role. And then over, the past 20, 30 years, you have seen emergence of different civic actors that were, playing a role and contributing to organizing people. Now, they're not as strong as other forces, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But again, it does reflect a change in the types of organizational structures that were emerging in the region. You also started seeing a chipping away of barriers of fear. And the idea that there's a lack of agency, that like, what am I? I'm just a person. I can't change anything when I'm up against these big behemoths of states that are backed by various international powers. So that started to get chipped away at, partially because I think that there's probably a lot of different reasons for that. I do think that social media to a certain extent played a role because people were a little bit detached and can come up and say things, and more people would kind of, latch onto that. And, it created kind of a place or a space where people can voice themselves. And initially with the emergence of social media, many of the states in the region couldn't really control that. So, now we see a much more aggressive crackdown and surveillance of social media. But initially, even before the 2011 protest, one of the kind of catalysts that happened before that in Egypt was in 2006, there was a strike of textile workers. And a number of youth actually, in solidarity of that strike, they created a Facebook page called, to call for a general strike in support of textile workers. That ultimately emerged to the April 6th youth movement. Many of the people that were part of the movement were part of the Ayman Noor presidential campaign. So there were so many things happening. It wasn't that the Arab Spring just happened like, out of nowhere and there was nothing, building up to that. And so there was a lot of these things that helped kind of break the barriers of fear and the idea that like individuals can't really contribute to redefining their destiny. So again, I think, where we are now is that there are a wide range of longstanding social, economic, and political grievances. And, those were contributing to the 2011 protests. And again, in 2019, we saw a new wave of protests erupt in Sudan, in Algeria, in Iraq, in Iran. So, it's likely that these eruptions will continue until some of these outdated structures and institutions in the region, that have created these conditions are reformed. In terms of the challenges to democratization, certainly, many of these environments were pretty closed and repressive to begin with. Obviously, there's different degrees and variations. But certainly after the Arab Spring, there's been a tremendous backsliding. As Shadi described in Egypt in particular, there was a military coup. There are tens of thousands of political prisoners. But even in countries that were less repressive, like Jordan and Morocco, we've seen also kind of backsliding there. And particularly, there's certain targets, right? The targets often tend to be, certainly the Muslim Brotherhood is a significant target of the crackdown and closing space, but also independent media. Any kind of civic activists are also very much targeted and threatened, because oftentimes they're seen as even more of a threat. If these types of, liberal kind of democratic voices were able to kind of establish more of a presence and grow their networks, they could pose a significant threat. So it's there's been often kind of attempts to preempt those types of movements before they can muster or take root and build broader networks. Another challenge, is the kind of ongoing conflicts in the region. We have, 3 ongoing wars with essentially no end in sight, and violence in several other countries as well. There's also, and one of the, we actually today had a conversation with a think tank leader from the Middle East, and one of the things that he talked about was that, as democratic actors during the Arab Spring, one of the things that we were naive about was that, the role and the strength of counter-democratic forces. And that includes both kind of the established supporters of the status quo within these countries, but also it includes malign authoritarian actors like Iran and the Gulf countries, and the level of investments that have come from Saudi Arabia and UAE and Qatar on different sides of this battle. But they've really kind of, especially countries like Saudi and UAE have invested tremendously to kind of, to make sure that some of these democratic movements are aborted before they can take hold. And then, in addition to that, that happened very much in parallel with a lot of the international community that typically supports democracy and governance, really losing interest in the region. And that, again, there was shifting international attention on the part of Europeans and US to a certain extent and other actors, shifting away from kind of democracy and governance work to refugees, migration, countering extremism, and other kind of less controversial issues like economic development. Though in my opinion, economic development in the region is always going to be, it's not going to be able to be effective unless you change the actual structural challenges that you have in this region. And then, in addition to that, there's also the issue of weak democratic forces. I will say that there's a very resilient civil society. It's weak. It is, it often doesn't have strong mass-based membership, but it is resilient. And I think that despite kind of the wave of arrests and the crackdowns and the types of conditions that many of these groups work under, you do see innovation. You see a persistence in them trying to pursue democratic goals. Against all odds, really, but there is that resilience. But again, I think the conditions there are not such that allow them to develop a solid, cohesive, unified voice or organization. I also think that one of the bigger challenges now is a growing sense of public disillusionment with the prospects for democratization. I think some of the recent polling that's come out of the region has shown that people just feel like the situation is hopeless. And even in countries that have made some progress towards developing democratic institutions, like Iraq, like Tunisia, there's to a certain extent a nostalgia for days of more kind of authoritarian rule because they haven't seen democracy deliver. So I think that's going to be a really big challenge for some of these countries that have at least made some traction towards developing democratic institutions and processes. How do you make democracy deliver for people? So, with that, just closing on three thoughts that I think are important to think about, like what really needs to happen for democracy to take root in this region. First, I think there's a need to address the underlying causes of instability, such as weak governance, institutions, and social cohesion, as well as the malign domestic and foreign actors. Now, we've all kind of been following the news about declining oil prices in the region. That could potentially have, it's too early to tell, but that could potentially have an impact on the region's political landscape. The declining oil prices affect both the region's oil producers, as well as countries that were beneficiaries of those investments. And so that combination could potentially affect the landscape in the region, as well as some of the regional conflicts that we're seeing. Second, there's a need to open and strengthen civic and political space and allow for the free flow and competition of ideas and constructive citizen engagement. I don't think that there's a shortage. I don't think that there's anything inherent about the Middle East that prevents democracy from taking root. You just need the space. You need the space for people to really kind of debate these ideas in the open and to be able to work towards that. And then third, I think there's a need to kind of push back against and provide alternatives to authoritarianism and statist political and economic structures, because I do think that sometimes, even when you do have transitions, you basically replace authoritarianism with other authoritarianism, a different brand of authoritarianism. So it's really important to kind of, and I think this also relies on there being space. There needs to be that space for those alternatives to emerge. So I'll leave it at that.
Super, thank you very much. Shadi, just to follow up a bit, a question about Islamism or Islam more generally. How do you see that relating to democratic governance, and what are the remaining prospects and challenges? Pick any example you want. It's hard to generalize across the whole region.
Yeah, so this to me is one of the fundamental issues from a U.S. policy standpoint, what I sometimes call the Islamist dilemma, where we want democracy in theory, but we don't necessarily want democracy's outcomes in practice. So we've been a bit torn, and there's a number of examples of that. An early and quite striking example was in Algeria in late 91, early 92, when the Algerian military stepped in after just as an Islamist party was about to take a commanding seat in power in the government. And then we saw other examples, Hamas in 2006, and of course the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power with Mohamed Morsi as president in 2012. And I think it's important to look at this dilemma quite closely, because it brings into stark relief the tensions between ideals and interests. And I think that's sometimes a problematic way to look at it, because it presumes that values and interests are separate, discrete categories? What if, in fact, they're intertwined? And, you know, that perhaps that's something that we can discuss. I'm certainly of the view that in the long term, supporting democracy in a region like the Middle East will be in our interests, but there's a lot of people who disagree with that, or who think the costs of promoting democracy are simply too much, and that's why we should, as discomforting as it may be with it, we should fall back on reliable authoritarian allies. I mean, that is a narrative that we hear more and more, and I think not just folks, as Amira said, in the Middle East have lost faith to some extent in democracy from the polling that we've seen, but also American elites in the so-called foreign policy establishment have soured on the idea that we can support democracy even if we wanted to, and some don't even think we should want to promote democracy in the Middle East. When it comes to groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, it also, I think, brings into stark relief two different commitments that most Americans have. Most of us are small d Democrats, and most of us are also small l liberals. So democracy would emphasize more the desires and preferences of the electoral majority, and that would be expressed through regular elections at specific intervals, 4 or 5 years, whatever it might be. And democracy, small d democracy, would also put more emphasis on accountability and responsiveness to the electorate, where the classical liberal tradition, of course, would have a stronger emphasis on personal freedom, civil liberties, minority rights, women's rights, so on and so forth. Now, sometimes the two can work hand in hand, and that's generally been the American view, and that we draw on. Part of that is because of our own history. If you're alive in the U.S. now, a lot of your experience will be democracy and liberalism going hand in hand. Now, of course, if you were alive closer to the founding, you would have probably seen the tensions more, and the founders discussed the tensions between democracy and liberalism at some length, and there were certainly fears of the tyranny of the majority and so on and so forth. So the rise of Islamists did present that kind of challenge, because we weren't used to that trade-off being as explicit. And even if we go back to the 2000s, George W. Bush and his administration were somewhat naive in thinking that, you know, if you open things up and give people the right to vote, that they will vote correctly. What we find out is that sometimes people do not vote correctly. And of course, we can problematize what it means to vote in the right way or in the wrong way. I'm a bit of, my view isn't necessarily the majority view, but I'm of the position that democracy at some basic level is the right to make the wrong choice. Some people do not think that's what democracy is or should be.
Interesting question. Well, let's open the floor to questions. If you'd like, raise your hand or type out a question in the chat line, and we'll try to see everyone have an opportunity to weigh in. The subject is so complex. I noticed that, Amira, among the factors you mentioned, demographics must be a part of it too. Isn't there a younger demographic, and certainly in Egypt and in the other countries of the region that brought together the Arab Spring?
I mean, demographics is certainly a huge factor. And I think it's not just in Egypt, but across the region, you're dealing with a very, very young population. That certainly contributed to the types of movements that we saw in 2011 and then again in 2019. And in general, Egypt or the Middle East is not the only case for this, but, historically where you have these types of large youth bulges, those are pretty momentous for kind of reform and change movements. So I think that's certainly very much tied to all of the different factors that I mentioned. I'm sorry, I didn't mention that, but certainly in terms of like taking advantage of the new information space, the new types of organizing, youth were very much front and center to that.
I see Paul and Victoria have their hands up. And then Jen, I see yours. So let's start with Paul and then Victoria and then Jen.
All right, great. Thanks a lot. I actually had a question for Shadi here. Well, let me back up real quick. My name's Paul, and I'm a policy advisor at the U.S. Helsinki Commission on the Hill. So I work for members of Congress, both parties, both chambers. And the Helsinki Commission is all about human rights, democracy, and the rule of law in foreign policy. And in fact, I am one of those crazy guys you described, Shadi, of the opinion that we should be promoting democracy all over the world. And in fact, the more we can promote democracy, the better. We should be promoting human rights. We should be promoting rule of law. That to me is the purpose of the United States, that in the world, So I think that when I hear the realists tell me we need to support authoritarians in the long term or the short term or whatever, all I can do is sort of shake my head. So with that being said, I'll profess my, ignorance to Middle East politics as compared to perhaps European, Eurasian politics, where I spend most of my time. Nonetheless, I certainly like to think that a lot of politics around the world works fundamentally the same way. That is to say, dictatorship relies on corruption and cronies and that sort of thing. It has a much smaller group of people it requires to stay in power. So it's all about paying off those people. And democracy is a larger group. So you end up, relying rather on good policy creation and that sort of thing most of the time in order to be reelected and so on and so forth. That, I guess, brings me to my question, and that is, when we look at Islamism and when we look at kind of Islamic parties or Muslim Brotherhood or whatever else, are we kind of looking at the highest level, sort of the window dressing, the top stuff, and getting really scared when in fact, the youth and the people that support these parties and all that kind of stuff are really more against corruption and misrule and the things that pretty much, all the people that drive this kind of stuff all over the world are against? I mean, should we be welcoming a shot for these guys to give it their best? And in fact, should we be expecting perhaps something more moderate than we might think? Thanks.
Unmute yourself, Shadi.
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, Paul, thanks for your question and comment. I mean, it is nice to hear that there are still folks like you in the government. It's always reassuring. So I guess one thing I would say is if we want to respond effectively against the realists, if that is in fact our goal, I think one thing that we haven't done as well is acknowledging that there are trade-offs. Like, I'm always a believer that it's good to kind of just start the conversation with some of the difficult stuff instead of pretending that all good things go together. All good things do not go together. And this is where the tension, even between all the great goals that you mentioned. So we want to promote human rights, minority rights, rule of law, and democracy in terms of regular elections. In the Middle East, we have found that some of those objectives, all worthwhile, can be in tension with each other. And I think the best way to address that is to be open about some of those tensions and to even acknowledge that realists sometimes bring up relevant concerns. So if they say something like, well, what if we push hard on the Sisi regime and try to suspend military aid, and the Sisi regime withdraws support on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process? Now, I don't think that is a compelling argument, in part because there is no peace process. Mm-hmm. But in the kind of DC context, that's the kind of thing that we have to be prepared for. Or let's say the Egyptians tried to punish us for our pressure and withdrew certain kinds of counterterrorism cooperation, or overflight rights, or Suez Canal access. There's a number of scenarios. I don't buy them all necessarily, but that's the kind of thing that we have to engage on. Now, the second part of your question, I think, is really interesting, which is, should we welcome Islamist parties coming to power? And are we all basically the same? Is there a fundamental desire that all electorates have, and that we should be we should realize that and therefore not freak out accordingly. So I have generally been a critic of the we're all basically the same argument. And of course, at some level, we are all basically the same. There are fundamental things that all human beings want to one degree or another. But there are also things that different, in different regions of the world, there are different flashpoints and different points of emphasis that make things either more or less challenging. So I would argue in the case of the Middle East, because Islam does play a more outsized role in public life, and all the polling we have makes this pretty clear, that the Middle East is unusually conservative in religious terms. Now, there's no reason for us to oversimplify that and say, everyone is conservative in the same way. It's a spectrum, and some countries are more religiously and socially conservative, other countries are less so. And we have to be very careful about looking at the specificities of each case, but we can make broader observations on the regional level. And if Islam does continue to play this outsized role, even in countries where anti-Islamist leaders are in power. So Sisi in Egypt is as anti-Islamist as you can get. He hates the Brotherhood and he's been trying to destroy them. But that doesn't mean that Sisi himself is a secularist. And that's why, even though sometimes we can use it as shorthand and say you have Islamists and secularists, that is an oversimplification, because even some who seem more secular still want Islam to play a prominent role in public life. They just disagree on what that role looks like in practice. But once you sort of inject public debates with more religion and divides over religion. So Islam, from my standpoint, Islam is not the problem. It's the inability to resolve foundational divides over Islam. That's the problem. And then that's why the question for me becomes, how can democracy help give people of the region the tools to address these foundational divides? And so for me, the point of democracy isn't so much that it produces liberal outcomes over time, or that it makes societies follow this secularizing course. I'm not someone who believes in this sort of teleological story that all societies become more secular over time. I do believe that democracy as a procedural system is very good at taking war. Let's say if war or violent conflict is part of the state of nature, if you will, that democracy is war by other means, war by peaceful means. It acknowledges that conflicts are there, but it proposes a different way of resolving or addressing them. So, and just last thing I'll say is and so we shouldn't welcome. I won't go to a congressperson or an advisor to the administration and say you should welcome the Brotherhood winning, because let's be honest, that is not where most Americans are at. And as a small L liberal myself, even though I have my critiques of the classical but also modern progressive liberal worldview, I wouldn't want to live under an illiberal regime as an American, and I can understand why Americans would feel uncomfortable, very uncomfortable, with groups like the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power. But what I would say is that isn't really our question to answer. That we should promote processes and worry less about outcomes of who actually wins. That ultimately should be left up to the people of the region. If they want to vote for liberals, for Salafis, for socialists, for the Brotherhood, obviously there are certain restrictions on, terrorists are not, first of all, they don't believe in democracy, so they're not contesting democracy in democratic elections. And this is why it's important to make distinctions between what I call mainstream Islamist parties like the Muslim Brotherhood, and then extremists who are on the extreme right of the spectrum, if we look at it as a continuum. And that's important certainly for US policymakers, because unfortunately, especially on the conservative side of the spectrum, there is a tendency to conflate all these groups as being part of this undifferentiated mass of badness. So I think that's one place to start, but also to emphasize means over outcomes.
Amira, do you want to chime in? The National Endowment for Democracy is all about promoting democracy, democratic institutions, civil society around the world. How do you see the prospects and your role?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the goal is, for us, we don't support or promote a particular brand of democracy. It's about certain elements of democratic process, including accountability, good governance, transparency, freedom of information, civil liberties. So that's really what we're working towards. And the idea is, once you have those types of institutions and structures in place, you have, as Shadi described, you have mechanism to basically adjudicate grievances and conflicts. So in essence, it's a system where you can navigate different contentions and cleavages in society. I think also one thing to add to that is, I think we often feel that the kind of authoritarian allies that we have in the region, that they are also kind of promoting the types of values or ideals that we do in their home countries. I will add that, like in Egypt right now, even though the Muslim Brotherhood is a banned organization, there are still more conservative, more radical religious groups that are part of the political system and generally empowered by the Sisi regime. And that's been a trend in the region, where you have, to a certain extent, authoritarians needing a more kind of radical extreme to justify their own existence. So I think as you look at, again, like the region over time, those types of leaders have not decreased the types of challenges in the region that create foreign policy challenges for us, right? So, you have regimes in Egypt and Saudi Arabia that have actually kind of contributed to global terrorism. So I think, it's not so simple to say that, these are regimes that are, pro-American and they're going to support our interests. I think they play a game where they have double speak, where they kind of promote their interests to American stakeholders, but then at home, they're actually kind of fueling the fire that creates problems for us in the future.
Right. Victoria had a question.
Hi, thank you so much both for coming to virtually speak with us today. This is kind of relevant to, current reality of COVID-19. I would be very curious to hear both of your thoughts on how do you see COVID-19 and the government and the Middle East region's different government responses to the pandemic adversely affecting authoritarian tendencies within the region? Do you see in a post-COVID-19 world, the Middle Eastern region maybe being even more authoritarian or maybe more democratic post-COVID-19? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll just start. So I guess, first of all, it's difficult for some of these regimes to become more authoritarian than they actually are. So at some point we're talking about like how much can you really push this? Of course, we see evidence that the Sisi regime is trying to, in various ways, use this moment of crisis to further restrict speech and consolidate power and so on. So that's also a broader concern in the world. Hungary, Poland, other cases where there are concerns that even these hybrid regimes that are have been democratic but are moving perhaps in a more illiberal and perhaps even authoritarian direction might find ways to take advantage of this moment. Some of it depends on how long the effects of COVID actually last. The bigger effect from my standpoint, though, is what it means for the U.S. role in the world. So let's say Biden wins. To what extent, if COVID continues to be a primary concern domestically for the U.S., and it may very well be for another, year. It's really hard to know at this point, but it does mean that energies that would have been previously expended on certain foreign policy issues may no longer be expended on those issues because there's a finite amount of energy and attention and resources that we as a country have. And a lot of focus will be on addressing domestic issues and healing national divides, but also that our foreign policy will be oriented around addressing COVID related crises if those do in fact continue. and they may continue. And we've seen how COVID is exacerbating the situation in conflict areas in Syria and Yemen. In Libya, civil war continues to rage. It's not as if the appearance of COVID has caused people to stop fighting each other. In some ways, it's exacerbated some of those divides because the world isn't watching. The world doesn't seem to care, although there is maybe now some more attention on Libya. But certainly from a U.S. standpoint, the Trump administration is not paying much attention to the Libyan civil war and to really some big developments that are happening literally as we speak. So the question is, can the U.S., if I'm personally making the case for democracy promotion being elevated as a greater core concern, which I feel quite strongly about as part of our long-term vision, is my argument going to get a hearing when people say, well, Shadi, this is all nice, democracy, all this stuff, but come on, like COVID, or like, look at all these other crises. Do we have the luxury to think about these other issues? And then it becomes more challenging for many of us to actually make the case that this should still be important, and not just important, but a core priority for U.S. interests and values.
Good point. Amira, do you want to add?
Sure. Just, I think it's still too early to know how, COVID-19 is going to affect the region in terms of whether it will be more or less authoritarian. I do think there's a couple of indicators to take a look at. Certainly there has been, as I mentioned, post-Arab Spring, there has been a trend of closing space, and this was another opportunity to further close space, because, the requirements for social distancing, there was an opportunity to use that to kind of shut down more information spaces. Many of the more authoritarian countries also really want to control the narrative on this. So there's been, a particular uptick in crackdowns against independent media outlets and journalists. But at the same time, this will put further pressure on some of the institutions of governance that were already a source of grievance in the region. How people react to that it's still to be determined. I also, one of the things that I mentioned earlier is, one of the declining oil prices that started not just from COVID-19, but it was further exacerbated by COVID-19. But that also could change the extent to which the Gulf invests in the region. Again, I think it's too early to know this for sure, but that's certainly something to watch, whether they're going to be able to. Right now, some of these countries are not able to balance their budgets because of the price of oil. So I think that's something to watch. But even if that were to happen, the question is who would fill that gap? And there's some that argue that, China is positioning itself to potentially fill that gap. So that certainly wouldn't work in the favor of democratic reform in the region. I will also add that, there was one other thing I wanted to say, but it slipped my mind. I think we'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much. And of course, the ability of governments to deliver public health is going to be really one of the central concerns of the COVID period we're in. If there is a major failure in any of the states and public health really declines, that's going to be a problem for the governments. Jen, you had a question.
Yes, thank you both for taking the time today, especially after hours, to be with us. I'm a grad student at Georgetown. I'm at the UN Foundation this summer. Great. And I was hoping you could speak a bit more about integrating women's equality in the push for democracy, either a bit further afield in Afghanistan, the peace process, or elsewhere in the region. What are the prospects of that?
I think that especially in this last wave of protests in 2019, women were very much at the forefront of those movements. And I think that, there has been a push, to, not just working on women's issues, but really kind of engaging women in larger kind of political reform issues that affect all people in these communities. I think part of the challenge is that there are certainly more voices that are working on this issue, but for it to kind of develop into a larger kind of women's movement that has grassroots appeal, it's still a work in progress. I think on Afghanistan in particular, we've actually seen some really interesting work on the part of civil society of women trying to put forth a roadmap for the political kind of reconciliation efforts there, and to make sure that women's rights that have been achieved over the past 20 years are safeguarded during that process. So certainly, I think that in a place like Afghanistan, that was certainly one of the gains that took place in that country over the past 20 years. I think you have a very solid group of women activists, as well as women in the policy community, that are trying to contribute to what a political roadmap would look like there that would protect and safeguard those rights. And I just think that the extent that the international community could continue to support those efforts and create platforms for those women to kind of have a voice is especially important right now.
Super. Yeah, that's such a concern. Holly Ratcliffe, I think you had a question.
Hi, yes, thank you, Amira and Shadi, for being here, and for Leah for organizing this. My name is Holly. I'm a graduate student at Syracuse and a Robertson and Rosenthal Fellow this summer at State Department. My question, this is a pretty specific question, and you both sort of touched on this already, but I was wondering if you had an opinion about Saudi Arabia's influence in NEA region, specifically when it comes to the spread of their certain type of Islam, and how that certain type of Islam affects democracy and diversity in younger populations. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, so on the question of Saudi influence or religious soft power abroad, I'm not a big fan of the narrative that attributes a lot of causal power to the Saudi role, across the globe. I mean, the arguments made for a variety of regions, other Arab countries in Africa, Indonesia, Malaysia, you name it. It's one factor, but I see it as the Saudis wouldn't be able to change an entire culture or religious approach in Indonesia or Malaysia if there wasn't an audience that was receptive to a more conservative interpretation of Islam. So I think that we shouldn't dismiss the agency of the very individuals and citizens in these countries who I think even without Saudi influence, we would have seen a shift towards more conservative practice, simply because there was an Islamic revival that began in the late 60s and intensified in the 70s and 80s for a variety of reasons that are much more complex and historical, that deserve a lot of attention. Sometimes there is this tendency to try to look at easy causal explanations, and the Saudis can sometimes be the kind of the bad actor that explains things that otherwise seem complicated or irrational to a Western, largely secular audience. But it is the Saudi regime is obviously shifting, so that there's also a question of what that will mean going forward under MBS, So also the Saudi role is a variable in of itself. Even before MBS, we saw different periods where there were periods where the Saudis were more accepting of the Muslim Brotherhood's role, Muslim Brotherhood influence when it suited their interests. Later on, they became, over time, took a more oppositional stance towards the role of the Brotherhood for a number of reasons, and tried to support some Salafi groups against Brotherhood-inspired movements. So the Saudi role is complex, and one thing that's worth watching out for, Peter Mandeville, I would say, has done a lot of excellent work on this, and I think he has an edited volume coming out called, I think, Wahhabism in the World, that looks at Saudi influence in a lot of different contexts. Which is all just to say that it's complicated, and we should be careful about a particular narrative that reduces the Saudi role to one particular thing.
I just want to add that, aside from their support or lack thereof for a particular Islamic brand, they have invested financially pretty heavily in countering the democratic efforts in different parts of the region. First, during the Arab Spring, kind of investing heavily to preempt any kind of uprising happening within their own borders, but also, investing in Bahrain, Oman, even, trying to lead an effort to include Morocco and Jordan and the GCC countries. There was an effort to, so politically also playing a role to ensure that, Muslim Brotherhood type of political brand is not successful in the region, and also kind of preempting any kind of democratic effort.
And is that to say they're concerned not just about the region, but about their own domestic order? Is that the spur for them to be concerned about any examples set in other countries in the region?
I believe so.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I would say 100%. I think that this is partly a question for them of regime survival. They see the rise of Islamist parties through elections as an existential threat, because it undermines, first of all, the Brotherhood is one of the few transnational challengers to the on when it comes to religious legitimacy. And the Saudis have always been very sensitive about challenges to their own religious legitimacy. And certainly there have been moments during the Sahwa movement in the 90s where there were Brotherhood-inspired movements and intellectual currents that became more vocal in Saudi domestic politics that the Saudi regime found quite threatening. So for a lot of these regimes, they have ideological preferences, but their ideological preferences are always quite intertwined with their own conception of regime survival. So we should, and it's understandable from their standpoint. If I was the Saudis, I would also fund counter-democratic movements and institutions and whatever else it might be throughout the Middle East. They have a vested interest in not seeing anything resembling the Arab Spring or Arab Spring-like movements happening. And that's why they fought tooth and nail and very determined in pushing back in quite successful ways. So one question, as Amira has been saying, is to what extent can Saudi Arabia, but also we should note the UAE really sustain that role going forward. And that regional context is very important, but also that also involves the US role, because if the US was more involved in the Middle East and more engaged, we could theoretically put some pressure on Saudi Arabia and the UAE to do less counter-democratic advocacy. Because after all, I don't want to overstate it. I don't love calling Saudi Arabia a client state, because that makes it sound that they do whatever we tell them to. No, they don't. That said, we do have quite a bit of influence on the Saudi regime, because in some ways, we provide a security umbrella for their regime. We have for many decades. So we shouldn't forget that when it comes to weapons sales, when it comes to the basic running of their military, they can't do a whole lot without our spare parts, our maintenance, and our training and advisory support. And sometimes I think we lose sight of that, and we act as if our junior partners have more leverage over us than we have over them. No, we are the senior partner. We have considerable leverage. We don't like using our leverage, and we've often been afraid to use our leverage effectively.
One of the cardinal rules of real politics that Hans Morgenthau, the great real politician expert, wrote was that if you're a great power, you never let a small ally rule your policies. And we're seeing that in spades in many ways. Certainly our relationships with Israel and with the Saudis are to some extent reversed from the true power relationship we have. But let's talk briefly about the China and outside players, and to what extent will they interfere with, help, impede any kind of democratic movements? What will China and Russia, how will their roles affect the internal order in any of the countries that you're familiar with, and some kind of rise of civil society or democratic process?
I remembered something that I was going to mention earlier with regards to the question about the impact of COVID-19. I've been seeing a lot of this narrative. I've seen it from gongos and kind of media that's close to some of these authoritarian states, but they're really kind of making the case that, oh, look at how, in managing this crisis, authoritarian regimes are doing it much more effectively than democratic regimes. And they're using China as the case in point there. So I think that's one thing that's happening right now, that there's that kind of narrative battle. And again, I think it's way too early to kind of make that determination, but that's becoming very much kind of a narrative that I've seen quite a bit of. China has been gradually increasing its investment, particularly in the ICT and infrastructure in the region through the Belt and Road Initiative. Particularly so in some of the North African countries, and you see it more in Egypt as well. And there is, to a certain extent, this attitude that it's better for them to work with regimes that are authoritarian and corrupt. So certainly they're not going to be pushing for any kind of reforms. And at the same time, many of those regimes have a preference to work with that kind of government or regime which is going to be not pushing back on those types of issues. So I think that's something to certainly look out for. Again, Russia is very much also involved in the region, particularly in some of the regional conflicts. That's another one where we'll see with the impact on price of oil, of how much they can continue to sustain that at that same level, and especially when they're dealing with greater challenges in their own neighborhood. So I mean, I'll leave it at that.
Great. Shadi, do you want to add?
Yeah, sure. On China, so I think this will be one of the key ideological dividing lines going forward. Again, it's a bit of an oversimplification, but some of this is a response to how China is pushing the narrative itself, which is that authoritarian, centralized regimes are better at dealing with COVID and other national level crises more effectively. And they're finding ways to propagandize accordingly and pointing to American weakness, and even promoting conspiracy theories about how COVID actually was manufactured by the US and even the US military specifically, which is a conspiracy theory which has gained ground in the Middle East. Somewhat surprisingly, quite well-educated, intelligent people actually find, but there's actually an interesting, not to go into this too much, but there's actually an interesting academic literature on how smart, intelligent people can be just as susceptible to some of these conspiracy theories if it fits their ideological predisposition. So we shouldn't assume that rational minds will prevail. Anyway, so I think that what that means from a U.S. standpoint is, how do we engage in this ideological combat with China? And how do we do that more effectively? Trump is not an effective vessel for that, in part because he doesn't really prioritize the values part of this. And if we want to engage, I don't think we want to engage in a Cold War with China, but if we end up engaging in a Cold War with China because that's just the way things turn out, and it already seems to be, that's where things are going for a number of reasons, that we have to be able to speak to the ideological side of it. It's not just about trade. It's not about unfair practices in that regard, and that's what Trump tends to focus on. It's also about deeper questions of what China represents, and to say nothing of the re-education or concentration camps against the Uyghur Muslims, which is just remarkable that it's happening in broad daylight, and we all know it's happening, and yet China can get away with it. That would seem to be a key dividing line, but we have to speak out in a more compelling way about that, and we don't have the right messenger for that right now, even though there have been the institution of some sanctions on Chinese officials that came recently, but it has to go well beyond that, in my view. So I think that the question for all of us, anyone who wants to go into policy, is what does it look like to effectively counter the rise of China when it comes to this particular debate? Because authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, even though these are Muslim majority regimes that you would hope would otherwise be concerned about basically cultural genocide against other Muslims, but no. In fact, the Saudi Arabia, to name one example, has actually defended these re-education camps, and which is remarkable, that MBS would kind of go along with some of this stuff and refuse to criticize. But it's also to be expected, because power relations do matter. And many of these authoritarian regimes are increasingly economically dependent on China. China, as Amira said, wants to make more and more economic inroads for foreign direct investment. So we can't expect Muslim majority countries to speak out, because quite frankly, it's just not in their interest to do so. It's up to Western democracies, but also democracies more generally, to push back on China and China's growing influence in the Middle East, but also in Africa. It's not just in the Muslim world, it's also in much of sub-Saharan Africa.
Sure.
Can I just add a quick point on the Uyghur question? Also in Egypt, there was kind of deportation of a number of Uyghur students who are studying at Al-Azhar. And some of the discourse that's coming out about this is, oh, well, this isn't really a big deal. The Americans are making this a big deal because they have an animosity with China. So even the narrative within parts of the region is that, the Americans are raising issue with about the Uyghurs, the persecution of the Uyghurs, because they have some sort of vendetta with China. So it's completely the Chinese, I think, have been able to kind of play on that narrative. I also just wanted to add that there is this idea, I think, from some in the region that there is this kind of desire for a more multipolar world. So in a way, the Chinese and Russian role is not necessarily seen with suspicion, but seen as potentially something that would balance out the U.S. role, which honestly is often seen as one that, even by supporters of democracy, is seen as sometimes counterproductive to democratic development in the region.
Is that because they see us in opposition to the regime, or why would they be concerned about our support for democracy?
No, I think there's a feeling that actually in the U.S. has in many cases not sided with democracy and kind of sided with authoritarian. So the idea that, like, when we talk about malign foreign influence and the role that China and Russia plays in eroding democratic institutions abroad, there are some that see kind of the U.S. has played that role in the Middle East. So again, even from some who want to see reform in the region, they kind of are not concerned about having a more kind of multipolar balance in the region, which I don't agree with that, but I'm just saying that that's kind of a perception that's out there.
Had we been more supportive consistently and not played the Saudi game, would they have been more supportive of our role in the region?
I think it's hard to say yes or no to that. I think there's a longer history there, and there's a lot of different factors for that. But I think certainly if there was a kind of consistent support for the aspirations of local populations, and that that intent was made clear, I think even if it was really kind of an understanding and clear articulation of what is kind of the U.S. goal and interest in that part of the world, things would be different. But I think there's been a lot of kind of sometimes there's been a lot of inconsistency, and there's certainly been a lot of support for authoritarianism, or turning a blind eye to authoritarianism in the region, or kind of politicizing sometimes issues related to democracy and human rights.
Right.
And maybe just one thing to add on that point. I'm trying to like bring back my memories of the Obama era, because sometimes it's hard to remember that was even the world that we were living in. But from what I recall, I was living in the region at the time, and one question at various points, one question that I got constantly from Arab interlocutors was, Shadi, we can't figure out what Obama's policy in the Middle East is. And I couldn't figure out, I had my ideas, but it was confusing. And one of the reasons it was confusing was Obama had a particular, the way that I think I described it at the time was he had a split the middle approach to the Middle East.
Right.
And that's confusing in a region like the Middle East, where you don't want to send too many mixed messages. So what essentially ended up happening is that Muslim Brotherhood types felt that we were supporting ostensibly secular dictators. secular elites or so-called secular elites thought that we were in bed with the Muslim Brotherhood. So basically both different sides could all agree that we were bad, but for the opposite reason.
Sure.
And, you can't get rid of that completely. As Amira said, there's a long history and a lot of built-in distrust of the US, but you can be more clear about what your strategy is. But the only way to be more clear about what your strategy is if you actually have a clear strategy.
You have to have a strategy.
Yeah, Obama had a defensive. He knew what he didn't want to do, but when it came to actually discussing in an affirmative, positive, constructive way what he thought what direction the Middle East should go in and what direction U.S. policies should go in, there was very little of that laid out. I mean, even if you look at the Cairo speech, if you might recall, in 2009, there was a lot of goodwill. There was this honeymoon period where I think a lot of people were waiting and seeing to see what the U.S. would do under new leadership. But if you look at what Obama laid out in the Cairo speech, there was very little follow-up. And once things got messy, there was this tendency to fall back on authoritarian allies. And this has always been the problem with U.S. policy. With George W. Bush, who was, as far as we can tell, and I think he was sincere in this, ideologically committed to a really robust democracy promotion policy. But even he, once things got messy with deterioration in Iraq and the civil war in Iraq, and Iranian expansionism in the region, he too allowed his close advisors, who were more of a realist bent, to kind of push him in this direction. He went along with it to say, hey, well, democracy is nice, but we need our authoritarian allies. So one question that I think anyone who is pro-democracy has to answer, and this is part of the work that I've been engaged on, is how do we respond to this reality that whenever things get tough, U.S. policymakers who are under pressures that we who are not in government are not. I mean, they have a different set of concerns that they have to deal with on a daily basis. So it's understandable that they would find themselves challenged in this way. But that means that there have to be stronger arguments to resist the temptation. And I think we can look back and say, did George W. Bush's going back to authoritarian allies, did Obama's falling back on authoritarian allies after the initial optimism of the Arab Spring, did that actually lead to better outcomes? And my argument is that we didn't actually have better empirical outcomes, and we should be able to assess those after the fact. So, yeah.
My goodness, you've covered a huge swath of territory. It's such a complex region. And I think your comments about our inconsistency over democracy is a very important point on which to conclude, and also for us to continue individually and as a group to think about. I remember that not only did the president make his speech, his inaugural address, Bush's inaugural address in 2004, was a major paean to democracy. It was an incredibly ambitious and optimistic statement. Following up that speech, I think it was Condi Rice who made another speech about democracy in Egypt, and we singled out the Egyptian government on protection of Ayman Noor running for office in the time, and they sort of acquiesced to letting him run, but 6 months after the elections he was in jail. So what that said to the rest of the world was that it's convenient for us to work with the United States, and we can cooperate up to a certain point, but we have our national interests. And it was a disillusioning moment. Just as you rightfully point out, Shadi, that President Obama's policies were not always fully fulfilled or consistently carried out, because he was a middle of the roader, and middle of the roaders get bopped from both sides. And this is going to be one of the dilemmas facing the United States going forward. Do we have a strategic approach to democracy in the region? To what extent can the many civil society groups that Amira and Shadi pointed out have some legitimacy in that society, in any of the societies, to to persevere, to what extent can there be examples of democratic governance, even at the grassroots level? We've been talking high politics a lot now, national level decision making and so on, but there may be a role for democracy to bubble up from the grassroots or the rice roots with at least some experience. But ultimately, it will take governments at the national level supporting the democratic governance in the countries that we're talking about, in any countries, in order for them to have some kind of insulation, some kind of protection to be able to continue. So it's all about the rules of the game. And democracy has many virtues, and one of them is to set rules of the game that tend to reduce conflict and allow for competition, so that the competition can, in each side, see that they may have a chance the next time around, or they may be able to engineer the system to their advantage without having to have a conflict that totally gets out of hand and leading to civil war and violence and loss of life and loss of growth. So sustainability, resilience, these are concepts that are closely tied to democratic governance, and you've both brought them out so well. I want to say on behalf of all of us how much we appreciate your getting into the weeds with us on the issues we've talked about. It's a very complex and very important field, and we might pivot to the Far East or continue to pivot, whatever that means, but the United States won't be able to avoid dealing with the issues and the challenges, and I hope the opportunities that exist in the Middle East. So on behalf of all the rest of us, thank you, Shadi Hamid and Amira Maaty, for walking us through. Would you be willing to take any questions after the fact if anyone wants to email you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, feel free to share my email if anyone wants to follow up.
Great.
Same here, and yeah, you can share my email as well.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
It's really a wonderful evening of conversation. Much appreciate your giving us your insights. Thank you again, folks. Take care now.